Great. If all the speakers could turn their video. So we've got Amaka Vanni, have we got Steve Keen and Ladislou for us to start, Crisis Capitalism, and Lorenzo, our co-chair. You should be able to see the camera button at the bottom of your screen. Great, we have Lorenzo.
Yeah, hi everyone. So this is the first session of political and economic impacts of COVID-19. And as rethinking economics, we try to rethink also the role of the state in guaranteeing efficiency and fairness with out in a second to issue rating our we cannot come back to the old status quo in a certain sense. And nowadays we are going to see different things. The first session in the deepening of existing inequality in different areas from health to economic issues. And concern. Can you hear me?
Lorenzo, I think your internet is cutting out. Lorenzo, I think you're in. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Shall I?
That's bad.
Shall I?
Yeah, sure.
Take over the introduction.
Sure.
So yeah, and then if you can rejoin us, let us know. Thank you everyone for joining today. Today's session is Crisis Capitalism, as Lorenzo was just talking about. We've got three amazing speakers to connect up our theme on COVID-19. The political and economic impacts of COVID-19 is obviously hit a lot of us in lots of different ways, and that will be cut acrossing all of our different themes and sessions. Yesterday we had, today in fact, we've got a session with Serbi Kassar that will be immediately after this on the workforce and pandemic. And yesterday we had a really interesting discussion with Sheetal Chabria on the history of political economy, pandemics, or the health of economy. So today, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've globally seen the deepening of existing inequalities in different areas from health to economic issues. A central concern was related to the development of vaccines, patents, and also on preparing countries with health infrastructure for ensuring adequate vaccination coverage. If we consider the economic impacts, we have a two-folded issue. Wealth inequality has risen as some economic sectors like the financial sector and high net worth individuals were benefited from the imbalances caused as a side effect from the pandemic, and the need to overcome the existing foundational and theoretical aspects of economics as a science and capitalism controversies in order for us to create policies to deal with the crisis. Considering these, we have three speakers, Amaka Vanni, Ladislou, Dowbor, and Steve Keen. Amaka Vanni, who will be our first speaker, who's a lecturer in law at the University of Leeds, and whose research work lies at the intersectional of international economic law, development, and global governance. She holds a master's in law degree in international economic law and completed a doctorate in the same field from the University of Warwick. She's the current president of the African International Economic Law Network and also a contributing editor of Afrinomics.org and the African Journal of International Economic Law. Her doctoral thesis won the 2018 Hart SIEL Prize in International Economic Law, and her monograph is titled Patent Games in the Global South, Pharmaceutical Patent Law-making in Brazil, India, and Nigeria. Given this, Dr. Vanni will talk to us on COVID-19, TRIPS waiver, and transfer of technology. Please do take it away, Dr. Amaka Vanni.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So, thank you for the opportunity and for having me. My brief presentation will focus on COVID-19, TRIPS waiver, and transfer of technology. I did not prepare any slide because I wanted my presentation to be conversational. Before I start, I would like us to take a step back and understand the history of the TRIPS agreement and why what is happening now is not new. If anything, the capitalist IP system is functioning exactly as it was set up to do, to be extractive, to be exploitative, and to be exclusionary. So from the start, TRIPS was always contentious. This is because the protection of intellectual property rights, TRIPS agreement does not consider the development levels and socioeconomic needs between developed and developing countries. And these IPR laws are usually implemented with no form of social security in place. The result is the objectification of intangible resources, nature, and humans in the pursuit of profit on one hand, and on the other, the advancement of interests of corporate entities to the detriment of indigenous communities and countries in the global south. Thus, in this way, we see international law by the way of TRIPS agreements is playing a crucial role in helping to legitimize and sustain unequal structures and processes that manifest themselves in the growing inequality between the global north and the global south, but also within the global north. We must also remember that TRIPS agreements came about because the industrialized nations of the West, plus Japan, were threatened by the growing influence of generic manufacturers in emerging economies of Brazil, India, etc. At that time, and by that time I mean in the 1980s and the early 1990s, the generic pharmaceutical sectors of these countries, and even to some extent their tech and creative sectors, were coming into their own. Being an IP exporting country, the US was unhappy about this and felt that the lack of strong IP protection amounted to the expropriation of US-based companies' IP rights. Therefore, new tactics were needed to solve this problem, and one of the solutions came in the form of linking international trade regime with the development and enforcement of IP standards. The idea behind the linkage was to use access to markets of developed economies as an instrument to force these emerging economies to raise their IP laws and practices to a US-recognized level. And so the US employed certain means, such as the use of the Trade Policy Section 301 under the United States Trade Act of 1974 to address unfair practices on intellectual property rights in various countries. This practice allowed the US to withdraw trade benefits or impose duties on goods from foreign countries the US perceived to have poor IP laws. And so from the onset, we see the emerging of the trajectory that is fully formed today with the discussion on access to COVID vaccines via the TRIPS waiver and the transfer of technology to boost global supplies. We also see how the law, in this case, international IP laws in the form of TRIPS agreements, is used as a political tool to shape and secure global regulatory institutions to satisfy the self-interest of the US and strong IP exporting countries like the EU, Switzerland, and Japan. And so from the onset of TRIPS agreements, to the AIDS crisis of the 1990s and the early 2000s, when many developing countries, or when many in the developing world were dying as a result of lack of access to antiretroviral medicines, to now, during this COVID pandemic, we see how IP rules impede access to life-saving vaccines. In fact, the chapter in my new book, which is coming out tomorrow, focuses on how IP laws, how the IP laws we have now is structurally violent in the way these laws empower companies, and pharmaceutical companies specifically, to decide who lives and who dies. So understanding this historical context, including the reasons behind the marriage of trade with intellectual property rules, is relevant for us to grasp how TRIPS is structured, for who is structured to benefit from the agreement, who is excluded from such benefits, and why the structural inequities we are seeing today is not an anomaly. The system is performing just the way it was set up to do. If there is one thing I would like the audience to take away from this panel, is our understanding and the interpretation of tech transfer, especially within IP framework. So Article 7 of the TRIPS agreement reads, and I quote, "The protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights should contribute to the promotion of technological innovation and to the transfer and dissemination of technology to the mutual advantage of producers and users of technological knowledge, and in a way, and in a manner conducive to social and economic welfare and to a balance of rights and obligations." Article 7, as well as Article 8 on principles and the preamble of the TRIPS agreements, set out general goals and principles underlying the TRIPS agreements, especially in light of the object and purpose of the agreement. Indeed, many IP scholars have argued that Article 7 is context setting, in the sense that it provides a context for understanding and interpreting the enforceable rights and obligations. For example, the TRIPS preamble is a context-setting agreement. So seen this way, Article 7 sets the context that directs members to develop practices in a way that promotes the interest of all members of the WTO, both developing and developed countries. It provides the needed legal principles and rhetoric that often prevail in international negotiations, and acts as a reminder of the bargain that countries struck during the TRIPS negotiations. It also establishes the agreement's core value, which is like the aims of the previous international trade rule, the GATT, which is to apply trade and economic rules to raise living standards. Seen this way, TRIPS is not only for the benefit of developed countries, but also to improve the social and economic welfare of all members for the betterment of the international community, including those of the less developing country. So the discussion on transfer of technology within the framework of the TRIPS waiver is not an anomaly. It is supported within the TRIPS agreement. We have to remember that. So when discussing tech transfer, the benefit can be divided into immediate term and the long term. In the immediate term, right, tech transfer will support the development of low-cost manufacturing hubs overseas to boost the production of cheaper COVID vaccines. The impact is we will get more people vaccinated and bring an end to this pandemic, which has morphed from a global to a regional pandemic. So for instance, we are seeing people in Europe and USA are getting vaccinated and moving back to normal living. In other parts of the world, in Brazil, in India, in Nepal, in South Africa, COVID is still causing daily death and pain. Which countries, according to Bloomberg, are vaccinating their populations 25% faster than poorer nations? In fact, as of July 2021, only 3.4% of Africans were vaccinated, and it is estimated it's probably going to take around 2022 or 2023 for Africa to reach herd immunity. And by that time, there may be new variants. So if anything, this pandemic has really taught us that there is a need to democratize pharmaceutical manufacturing. In the long term, tech transfer will help many regions become self-sufficient, which is especially important for a continent like Africa, which produces 1% of the vaccines it administers and then imports the remaining 99%. The good thing about endeavors such as the tech transfer as being pushed by South Africa and India via the TRIPS waiver is that it will facilitate the development of not just vaccines, but not just COVID vaccines, but also for diseases that prevalent in the continent. Importantly, it could contribute to sustainable supply of vaccines and other essential medicines. It will help the continent also better prepare for future pandemics and provide a health security. So last month, as some of you might be aware, the World Health Organization announced an mRNA tech transfer hub that would let multiple companies share the recipe of how to produce the mRNA vaccines using the mRNA technology. At the moment, 2 South African companies have been chosen as the initial partners for the hub. Yet, pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Moderna, BioNTech, have refused to participate in the hub. And so what we are seeing in the global pandemic is twofold. First one, avenue to ensure less death, improve vaccine access and equity in the form of TRIP waiver is desperately needed. The TRIP waiver is being hindered either through protracted negotiation process or what the EU is doing via the introduction of competing proposal to sideline the discussion on the TRIPS waiver. We must also remember that the COVAX system continues to underdeliver vaccines and it has failed to meet its stated targets, both due to vaccine nationalism in high-income countries and also absolute lack of vaccines worldwide. Another thing we're seeing is that efforts to encourage the pooling of patents, such as pooling of patents and other IP, such as the CTAP, introduced by, I think, Chile or Costa Rica, I can't remember now, and also the mRNA Tech Hub, is not eliciting the necessary response from relevant actors. Instead, pharmaceutical companies are prioritizing market capitalization and also to protect their first mover advantage in not only COVID vaccines, but in other disease areas by refusing to share their COVID vaccine recipe or manufacturing process. So we see that what we are seeing now is the economic or the capitalist economic system we currently exist in, where capital has the tendency to get invested at a perceived higher rate of return, despite the harm and poor outcomes such investments may cause. In fact, I suspect that there could even be a more morbid reasons why pharmaceutical companies are withholding their know-how, right? Because having multitude of unvaccinated people increases the chances of mutations of more variants, which will drive the demand for expensive booster shots. And so, to conclude my brief presentation, what we need going forwards, right? Well, how we need to rethink and refocus in this pandemic is that the government, especially governments of developed economies like the US, like the UK government, like even the EU, they need to develop the courage to use available legal tools to take control of the mRNA technology and facilitate the transfer of the know-how to generate manufacturers in countries outside the developed West, or even as suggested by certain IP scholars, to buy outrightly this technology. Importantly, the pandemic provides an opportune moment to revamp global rules governing intellectual property, so that in the eventuality of the next pandemic, we are not caught again financing pharmaceutical R&D and then begging pharmaceutical companies to share not just the vaccines, but also the recipe that was developed using taxpayers' money. And finally, the TRIPS waiver has the support of over 100 countries, right? And even though it's not a long-term solution to this pandemic, it provides an important base for scaling up manufacturing and for the provision of basic health technology to address the pandemic and this global health emergency we are in. So developed countries need to support an expeditious conclusion of the waiver negotiation, and also to support the transfer of technology to developing countries across the world to democratize vaccine manufacturing and also to help these countries build their own manufacturing capacity and develop pharmaceutical independence. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting, and yeah, it's a really great point about the need to sort of like further democratize this work. Brilliant. Okay, so we're gonna go to our next speaker, Ladislou Dowbor. If you're able to turn your video on while I introduce you. So to discuss on inequality and wealth drainage on the COVID-19 pandemics, we have Ladislou Dowbor, who is a senior professor at Pontifical Catholic University in Sao Paulo on the political economy department. Dr. Dowbor received a PhD in economics and an MSc in social economics from the Warsaw School of Economics. He participated as a chief technical advisor at the United Nations in economic development and planning initiatives in different countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And he's currently consulting for some UN agencies. He's the author of more than 40 books. His latest books are Beyond Capitalism, New Social Architectures, and The Age of Unproductive Capital, New Architectures of Power. Please take it away. And there you have the book.
This is propaganda for myself, but we're working on new ways. You know, what all this mess shows. I mean, you put together the pandemic, but you have inequality. You have the drama in the environment we're destroying, and we're working very much in Brazil on this idea of the convergent of different crises. Yes, we have inequality, of course, we have the environment problem, we have financial chaos. I mean, money is not being used where it is necessary. We have this global economy, particularly finance is global, while the solutions must be national. We have no global government. And these things, I mean, money is global, and the central banks and government are national, and it just doesn't work. I consider this overall, I mean, this is how we're discussing quite a lot in Brazil, as a convergence of all these critical trends. Yes, environment, inequality, financial chaos, erosion of democracy, and the COVID-19 on top of that. These are the challenges. So I was very glad with Amaka Vanni bringing this as a systemic problem, because this is, I've been discussing, I worked 7 years in Africa, in different countries, but we have this in common. I mean, we are in a structure which is very difficult for us to manage the transformations we need. And the transformations are necessary. I wrote this Beyond Capitalism book. I mean, things are changing, really. And this, at the same time, it's an opportunity for change. Let me say, first of all, that in Brazil, the problem is not economic in the sense of lack of resources. If we take Brazilian GDP, $1.8 trillion, you divide it by the population, 212 million. This means what we have, what we produce in goods and services presently is roughly $2,600 a month per 4-member family. This is what we produce, $2,600. Now we have 2/3 of the population living on just a few $100s. So this is the problem. We don't have a Brazilian COVID problem. We have an inequality problem, and we have completely diverse situations in infrastructure, in well, in instruments, how do you ask people to isolate themselves, to protect themselves when they're living 5 people in one room? So inequality is central in this process. We have a problem that where is the money going? Inequality reached, we have 6 families having more wealth than the poorer half of the population. This simply doesn't work. And this means that at the bottom of the population, we have very low consumption capacity, and this paralyzes the economy. As you know, we have a very special government in Brazil. They declared that COVID was a kind of a small cold, gripezinha, as the president called it. And only now some measures, and very weak ones, are being taken. So the essential problem is that from the point of view of financial resources, we are not a poor country. We have the money. If you reduce just a little bit inequality, you can ensure everybody has a dignified and comfortable life. We have to bring this together. Just a small reduction of inequality will surely lead us to better social balance, a better economic balance, because the economy is not working. Also, we have an entrepreneur writing in the papers, yes, well, it is cheap for me to employ people in Brazil, but why should I employ people if I have nobody to sell to? Because the purchasing capacity of the population has been broken down. This is interesting because we had good policies with Lula and Dilma, what the World Bank called the golden decade of Brazil, 2003 to 2013. But this was broken down. And this brings us back to politics. I mean, we have to bring back politics and the economy to work for family welfare. It is as simple as that. Because when you bring more money to the bottom of the pyramid, you have more demand. The business can work better. They have whom to sell to. Yes, and this in Brazil will not generate inflation, because in Brazil, if you take the businesses are working at less than 70% of capacity, because there is this poverty. They have no one to sell to. So we have to get back to an economic sound cycle, where you put more money to the bottom of the pyramid, which generates demand, which generates employment, and consumption and economic activity generate resources for the state, and the cycle works. This has been broken down in Brazil. Let me give you some references. First of all, I think I've taught economics decades, and we speak of economic laws. They are not laws; they are rules. I mean, we need a pact. We have to choose what works for the population, what works for the planet, what works for the environment. Now we have a financial drain on our capacities, and it is not productive investment. It is basically banking and different financial systems. Let me give you some examples that we have interest rates. For example, if I go over my limit on my credit card, in Brazil, I pay 288% interest on this. This is tragical. I mean, in Canada, it's 11% a year. Yes, in Brazil, the banks present their interest rates in monthly rates, which seems small. This simply doesn't work. The average interest rate for business is around 40%. You cannot generate business with this kind of interest rates. This is very interesting. I wrote a book on this. It's The Age of Unproductive Capitalism, published by Cambridge scholars. It helps understanding how the financial system is draining the economy, not through productive investment, but through making money with money, to simplify the issue. This system is not generating employment also, and this is a key issue. We are a country of 212 million inhabitants, and here you have 150 million in working age, but only 33 million formal private jobs. 33 million, 150 million in working age. This is not working. We have in informal sector, people selling things in the streets, etc., roughly 38 million people, 15 million unemployed. I'm bringing these numbers because this shows that it is a structural problem. This is simply systemically not viable. We have to come back to, let's say, structural production, where COVID and other problems of the kind come together with making the economy work for the whole of the population, protecting the environment, reducing inequality. Well, this is basically what I wanted to bring you. This is systemically unfunctional, I would say. Thank you.
Financial system as a drain is something that one of the participants pointed out. So I think it's a really good point, and also talking about how these things are structural as opposed to, you know, just single issues. Brilliant. Okay, so moving on to our last speaker, Steve, if you want to turn your video on now. We have with us Dr. Steve Keen, one of the economists that realized that a serious economic crisis was imminent in 2008 and to publicly warn of it from as early as 2005. His pioneering work on modeling debt deflation resulted in him winning the Revere Award from the Real World Economics Review for being the economist who is most likely to prevent a future financial crisis. Dr. Steve Keen holds a Master in Economics and Economic History at the University of New South Wales and completed his PhD in Economics at the same university. Dr. Steve Keen will discuss on the existing contradictions of capitalism and its roots on economic theory and education so that we can rethink our economy in the face of the pandemic. Take it away, Steve.
Okay, thank you. I'll quickly go into sharing my screen. Let's see. And of course, it's more complicated than I'd like it to be. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my screen. And I'll get rid of the fact you're seeing yourself disappearing into the vortex there. So can somebody confirm that they're seeing my screen? I think that's the case. Okay. I want to go back to March of last year when this thing all began. And the case I was making back then is that we needed something I proposed as a cure for the 2008 financial crisis, which I knew had no hope in hell of happening. But I said, now it's obviously a time to reconsider this idea. And that's what I call the modern debt jubilee. And the idea is that if you look back to the last time we had a pandemic, I hope that's large enough to be seen. I'll make the screen a bit larger. That is the level of private debt back over here, private debt at the time the last pandemic began and when it ended. And that is between 60 and 70% of GDP, 50 to 70% of GDP with the private debt level. You can see this huge increase leading up to what was the stock market crash of 1929. and then a higher level again caused by deflation, which was during the Great Depression. But if you now take a look at where we are now, and I'll bring up another chart to show that it's a global phenomenon, we are now beginning at pretty much 3 times compared to GDP, 3 times the level of debt that applied back at the Great Depression. Now, given the financial commitments this meant everybody had, if we simply relied upon a private sector approach, completely private sector, no government intervention whatsoever, capitalism would have collapsed, because nobody could have, people could have not afforded not to go to work. By having to go to work, they would have spread the virus very, very rapidly. We would have had a catastrophic breakdown with something of, of course, we know the overall pattern of those who get ill versus those who don't was skewed towards the young during the Spanish flu and towards the old during this coronavirus. But the more chaos we have in that, the more variants that turn up, we would have seen, I think, a breakdown of the private sector, mainly because of the not just because of the medical, but also the financial implications. Because if you can't pay your rent, you get evicted. If you get evicted, you're on the streets. It's an appalling process of breakdown. And to show you that this is something which is a global phenomenon, this is the same data I've shown you over there. That's America's private debt level when the coronavirus began. We've now seen quite a substantial spike on that debt level, not so much because of an increase in debt, but a fall in GDP. And an increase in the indebtedness of the corporate sector rather than households. I'll show this is looking at the whole private sector. If I go and take a look at the corporations, you'll see it's corporations that are more massively in debt, whereas households, if we go to households here, have had a small increase, which is largely due to the drop in GDP. So the impact of this crisis has been held by the corporate sector that had to take on more debt to be able to it borrowed from the banks to pay Paul, fundamentally. And without that, we would have seen many more companies falling over. But fundamentally, we have a level of financial commitments which can only be met if people are working and in terms of making a profit. Because the COVID shut both those down, we had the potential for a global crisis coming out of it. And to show that it's not just the United States, this is the average for all countries in the BIS database. So the level of private debt has gone from of the order of 40% of GDP after the Second World War to 4 times as much now. And that was what I saw as the main danger. Now, we could have, my proposal was what I call a modern debt jubilee. And I know this is going to be very, very hard to see on people's screens. I'll just make this particular window a bit larger and make the point using this window of my Minsky software and make this larger again. If we use the state's capacity to create money to provide people with a cash flow during the crisis, we could do the same thing to reduce the level of private debt in the aggregate as well. And this was feasible with the COVID crisis. We could have done it. We did it to some extent. So governments which have been worried about running up a government debt and so on, the whole attitude of the neoclassical mainstream about how dangerous government debt was, that was sensibly forgotten when the crisis began. And we have seen deficits of the order of 30 and 40% of GDP during this crisis, but they should have been bigger. And there's no constraint to the government creating that amount of money. The mistake which the mainstream makes, which modern monetary theory has pointed out very well, is that governments don't borrow to spend, they create money when they spend. And then the bonds that they sell are a way of financing rather not financing, they're a way of converting the excess reserves that are created by the deficit into interest-earning bonds for the banking sector. So there's no problem in the government running a 30 or 40% of GDP deficit. I've seen mainstream people saying, isn't it great people could find this much money to lend to the government? That didn't happen at all. The government created the money by the deficit spending it's gone into. And the problems with the system have come from the government not doing that enough. In my own home country of Australia, and pardon me jumping between screens here, I'm trying to find a number of different presentations here. But in my home country of Australia, the government at the moment is resisting calls to pay people who were forced not to work by an outbreak of COVID in New South Wales, a mere $600 a week. Now, rather than doing it, they're holding off on paying those people $600 a week, which is about 1/2 a living wage in Australia. They're holding off doing it because they're worried about the budget deficit. Now, because of that, people are going to work who shouldn't be going to work, who should be staying home and stopping the disease spreading. So with a crisis like this, the private sector can't cope. The government, which has a limitless capacity to create money, could create the money needed for people to meet their obligations, and therefore mean they don't have to go to work as an alternative to being evicted by not paying the rent or not paying the mortgage. And that cash flow from the government sector should have been a major way to prevent the pressures that financial commitments put on people to go and work during a pandemic. We have done it to some degree globally, but nowhere near as much as we could have done. So this is one of the many, another instance of where the focus upon balancing the budget, the government's budget, austerity, has actually made the physical situation of the economies we live in much worse than they could have been if the government sensibly did not worry about the level of debt it's running. Now, I know I've got, so this is going far too quickly to show for a presentation on screen. My apologies for not having a proper paper put together. I've been too busy working on a paper on the failings of neoclassical economics over climate change. But I want to quickly indicate, using my Minsky software here, that if the government created the money to enable us to get through this crisis, created the money to enable us to cancel private debt, the impact would actually be a fall in debt levels. So this model is explained on my website, my Patreon website, if anybody wants to check out the argument properly. And what I have is a government, after 4 or 5 years into a simulation here, deciding to create sufficient government money to cancel 100% of GDP worth of private debt. And when that has happened at the 4-year mark in this simulation, which will come up in a moment, what happens initially is quite a substantial increase in the level of government debt for obvious reasons, but a larger still fall in the debt ratio for the private sector, because that government money creation redistributes income from the rich to the poor inside our countries, causes a large rate of turnover of existing money, boosts the GDP, and by boosting GDP, you reduce the debt ratio. So the ultimate outcome of a debt jubilee, rather than increasing the debt burden of the government sector, is to reduce aggregate debt dramatically. You can see the black line here. I'll just make that chart a bit easier to see. Pardon me. Okay, you can see when the Jubilee begins, the aggregate level of debt actually falls, and that continues happening as the Jubilee goes forward. So we have a mechanism that could enable us to finance people during a pandemic, to reduce the level of the burden on the private sector of excessive debt towards the banking sector. We've done it to some extent, but nowhere near enough to counter the effect of COVID. And what worries me is coming out of COVID, if we do ever come out of COVID, I've already seen, of course, in the UK, that the government is saying they've got to go into austerity after it to make up for the extra debt they went up in the process. That is completely unnecessary and will mean that we have a government-induced financial crisis coming out of the effect of COVID, of the aftermath of COVID. So it isn't, well, our mixed economies could have coped with COVID. They've coped with them moderately well, because the people running governments threw the neoclassical textbook out the window when the crisis began. But because they continue referring to it, we're making the crisis worse than it needs to be, prolonging the period needed to suppress the virus, whether that's by lockdowns or by vaccines. So a pure capitalist system would have just been destroyed by this virus. The mixed system we've been through has coped, but could have coped a hell of a lot better. And what worries me is that after this, we'll go back and unlearn the lessons that the government can create all the money it needs for any project. It's not a shortage of money that matters, it's a shortage of resources. And, you know, we continue learning and unlearning that lesson. And I've basically given up hoping we'll learn it properly. But this is another instance of seeing just like in the Second World War, it was financed by government spending. It wasn't the government borrowing from the private sector to beat off the Nazis in the Second World War or beat off the vaccine now. The government creates the money, and that capacity should be used more effectively in the future. Of course, as usual, I have very little doubt that it will not be used, because we'll go back to mainstream thinking about government spending after the demonstration of how effective it can be in fighting an existential threat like the virus. Thank you. Sorry for a bit of a jumbled presentation. I know that's not my normal standard, but I've been too busy recently.
Presentation, Steve. Thank you very much for that. No, I think, yeah, asking the question about whether governments will learn the right lessons or we will revert back is definitely a big theme of this festival. So now it'd be great to invite all the speakers to turn their videos on and their mics, and we'll go to some questions from the audience. I'll go through those as we don't have a great deal of time to answer them, and then I'll give you all an opportunity at the end to give any final comments. The first question is from AfIELN. Would someone be able to give AfIELN the ability to speak? Actually, I think AfIELN, you already have the ability to speak. So if you want to turn your video and mic on and join us on stage. Brilliant. I'm not sure. Oh.
Presentation. My question is to Dr. Vanni. It's nice to finally see you. We've been in touch over the email. As someone with legal specialization,
There's a crackle. There's
Very
a crackle.
bad, yeah. Can't hear what you're saying. Be better if you typed, I'm afraid.
AfIELN, I think.
AfIELN, write your question in the chat section.
Yeah.
AfIELN, maybe I'll just read your question. Sorry about that. So, can right-to-life legal regimes be an effective tool against executive collusion with transnational extractive regimes allowing for nationalization of IP for vaccines? I think this is directed to you, Amaka, but if Ladislou or Steve, you have anything to comment on that, please do. Amaka?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In a way, it could be used. So I think it was in India that the right to life argument was used to improve access to HIV medicines or cancer medicines. However, globally, I think the only country that used a human rights approach to improve access to medicine is Brazil. That was included in the Brazilian constitution, the right to health. And so the Brazilian state has a responsibility to the Brazilian citizens to provide adequate health care. Outside Brazil, I don't think any country has created into hard law the human rights approaches to access to medicines. However, with regards to the COVID pandemic, one of the approach that could be used is a national security approach, right? Because we've seen that this pandemic has no respect for borders and for government and for sovereignty, right? And so one of the ways I believe government can tackle the issue of collusion of transnational extractive regimes is to insist on the not sharing of the vaccines or the not sharing of the technology delays or impedes access to vaccines, which further puts the world or puts a particular country in a precarious situation, in the sense that mutations and mutations of various variants keeps coming up, and it's a form of national security. So I feel that is one way, a national security approach. It might seem too far-fetched, but it's one way state governments can use to ensure that technology is shared, and to prevent or reduce this collusion we are seeing. Another way is also through patent infringement. if we remember that the mRNA vaccine was partly funded by the National Health Institute in America of the US, that means the NIH has a patent right to the mRNA technology. And so the US government actually has a legal right to mandate Moderna to share this technology or even sue Moderna for patent infringement, because I don't think the US has legally established its rights with regards to the patent rights it has for the mRNA technology, saying that it was the research for this technology was partly funded by the US government.
Great, thank you for that, Amaka. Ladslou, did you want to come in on that point? Okay. Moving on to the next question, which is anonymous. So additionally, do you think that this is a sign, or I think that is probably referring to another question. I'm going to move to Mira's question, and then I'll try and work out what that first question is referring to. Mira, do you want to ask your question in person? If someone can give her the ability to do that. Okay, so Mira, I'll ask Mira's question. So in the context of such a systemic... here we go.
Yeah, okay, that was quick. Yeah, so hi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, in the context of such a systemic structural failure as this, are bank bailout using the taxpayer money only enabling and promoting the inequity? And as opposed to that, bank bail-ins, which use the money of the people who have invested in the bank, like, do they help to bring down or moderate this inequity prevailing in the system?
Great. So in the context of such a systemic structural failure, are bank bailouts using taxpayer money only enabling and promoting the inequity? Are bank bail-ins any better to moderate or bring down inequity?
Well, it sounds like one directed at me, so can you hear me okay? Okay. We have to make sure the financial sector doesn't fail during a crisis like COVID. So I was in favour of measures to provide the liquidity they needed during the crisis. But the thing we should be focusing on is not bailing out the banks, but bailing out the debtors. And that's what we haven't done. The emphasis has been throughout, right from before the financial crisis to now, bailing out the creditors. Now, the creditors are the ones who are in control. And in fact, you don't want the financial sector to fail, but you don't want to make the landlords and the rentiers wealthier and believe that's going to make the whole economy function better. It's reducing the burden on the poor that matters. So during the crisis, definitely in favour of keeping banks solvent. You don't want any bankruptcies to be caused by COVID, of anybody, including especially the banks. But having said that, what we should be focusing upon is reducing the burden on the debtors, reducing the burden on the poor, rather than the creditors and the wealthy. And that hasn't been done during COVID. It probably won't be done after, and I imagine we're going to go back into the same mistakes of thinking capitalism works best when you rescue the rentiers rather than rescuing the poor.
Let me say, Lawrence, that this is particularly visible in Brazil. Steve, we have in Brazil 62 million adults, putting the children, this is 40% of the population, which are deeply in debt. And 25% of them are in personal bankruptcy. This is simply not working. All the special transfer of funds by government has gone to banks. And banks have been sitting on this money. Part of it is going to tax havens. I mean, the problem is not having money. It's not where it comes from. It's rather where it goes to. I mean, all this modern monetary theory has helped us with this. Because, for example, if you put money in sewage, it is so important for health. $1 you put in sewage is $4 you don't spend on sickness, on health problems. So actually, this is the key issue. Now, we've put the numbers together on how much is taken out of GDP. It's not the stock of debt, but the drain by the interest. The drain by interest is 16% of GDP. I mean, no country can work like that. Now, you add the public interest rate, interest payment on the public sector, which is roughly 5% of GDP, you have a drain of 20%. So, yeah, I've put these numbers together. This simply doesn't work. So, getting back to the basic thing, I think, Mira, the essential thing, these banks and this money have to be useful. There is a question here by Jose Osorio, yes? Dowbor just said that putting more money in the hands of people with lowest income will increase employment. Please clarify. I mean, this is the thing. During the Lula and Dilma government, I mean, we put more money at the bottom of the pyramid. It is not just Bolsa Familia. There were 149 programs of inclusion. This generated resources at the bottom, and since this would have caused inflation if there was no production capacity. But with business working at 70% of capacity, you stimulate everything because the business has whom to sell to, so this works. And both activities generate resources for the government. So we calculated in Brazil that the 1 real or $1, whatever you put into head at the bottom of the pyramid, it is 1.5 created in growth of GDP. The essential thing is we are not in government. I mean, who controls the money? Basically, the government and the banks, and we have a banker in government. So it's hard to change the things.
Great, thank you for that, Amaka. Thank you for your question, Mira. Amaka, did you want to comment on any of these points?
Yes. I'm trying to find. Hold on, I'm trying to find the question. Please, can you read out the question? I can't.
It's gone off, but I can, rephrase and state it. So now that everyone's spoken about that there is this systemic inequity in place, how are bank bailouts, which are mostly, employed, are they furthering or enhancing the systemic inequity prevailing right now? And as opposed to bank bailouts, will bank bail-ins come into picture? And when they are looking into the picture, will they help reduce systemic inequity or at least moderate it? That was the question.
Thank you, Mira.
Is the question for me?
We're just asking if you wanted to comment on that, but we can move to one of the next ones.
I'm sorry, this is not my area of expertise.
That's it. That's okay. Let's move on to the next one. Thank you for your question, Mira.
Thank you.
So do you think that this is a sign that we would need to go back to the essence of political economy to tackle inequality problem and not only turn to economics as a hard science? So do you think that the pandemic is a sign that we need to go back to the essence of political economy to tackle inequality?
Anyone?
Who wants to take this one?
Ladislou, do you want to go first on that one? I'll go second this time.
Well, this is all about politics. As I said, in Brazil, I worked in very, very poor African regions where really you have no resources at all. This is not a question of Brazil. We are a rich country, and the essence is that we use these resources. So this is actually a political issue. We have the very fine law Amaka Vanni was telling about. We have the SUS. This has been saving us, which is a free health system in government. That this has been a key issue for reducing the dramas. Now Brazil has over 500,000 people dead already, and rescuing the capacity. We have to ensure more money at the bottom, because we have 19 million people going hungry, and 116 million with recent numbers, people who have food now and then. In a country which is a third world producer of food, only in grain, we produce 4.2 kilos per day per person in Brazil. All this goes to export because it's in the hands of the great commodity traders. You just look at it from different sides. It's lack of a policy organized according to the needs of the population. This is not only money in the pocket of people, because I work with this reference that 60% of family welfare, economic welfare is money in the pocket. The other 40% is access, for example, security. You don't buy police, you don't buy the hospital, you don't buy the schools. So you need the social policies. Yes, and we need public employment programs, as being discussed now with the United States. People are working for the markets to solve. The markets will not solve this. We need much more ample, and we need investment in infrastructure. So we know what has to be done. What is the orientation? And we have the resources, but managing the resources means the tax system, yes, which has been changed. For example, in Brazil, dividends do not pay taxes. I mean, this is completely surrealistic because the Brazilian millionaires just don't pay taxes. I'm a professor, I pay 27.5% on my salary. So it's organizing the tax system, the credit system, and the fiscal policies to make money go where it is necessary. And there is a management issue. Brazil has more than 5,000 municipalities. It's a huge country. All the money is in central government. This simply does not work. If you do not bring money nearer to the population, to the municipalities, because if money goes to the municipalities, people can participate and organize their priorities. This is basic management. It's not ideology, let's say. See? So we have. I work with these three levels. I mean, what has to be done? Yes, the basic income, infrastructure, employment programs, the financial area, which is reforming the tax system and the credit area, and decentralize the economy to make it manageable. Such as it is, it simply doesn't work. For me, it's a central issue because we have officially political democracy, but no economic democracy. No political democracy without economic democracy. This simply doesn't work. You have to bring these things together.
Amaka, I'll go last this time. Okay.
No, you go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think the idea that there's a clash between economics as a hard science and tackling inequality is a sign we've been brainwashed by neoclassical economics, because what's that taught, as well as a ludicrous model of how capitalism actually functions, it also has a ludicrous model of income distribution and wealth, arguing people get paid their marginal product, and therefore, and then justifying outrageous salaries for the financial sector on the basis that only earning those salaries if they're contributing that much to output. Now, when you throw that garbage out the window and look at the economy as a complex system, and this is what I do with my Minsky software and my dynamic approach to economics, I find that income distribution reflects power. And the same work is done by Blair Fix, finding that that by far statistically what determines your income earning is not your so-called marginal product, but how high you sit up in a hierarchy. So this is a hierarchical income inequality, wealth inequality society is an essential part of what capitalism actually is. And when we understand that, we can throw the rest of neoclassical economics out the window as well. So the essence of political economy would be getting rid of neoclassical economics and all the nonsense that stuffed our brains with, and building a dynamic, non-equilibrium, complex system, monetary vision of how the world operates. And in that world, inequality is vital. Rising private debt causes rising inequality. And that's another reason why I want to drive private debt down, to reduce the level of income and wealth inequality.
Great. Amaka, do you want to come in on that? Sorry, Ladislou.
Yeah, I love the idea of Steve of throwing so many views out the window. This is garbage. Really. Yeah. I mean, Michael Hudson calls it junk economics. I have worse names for this.
We share them after the meeting.
Coming down to earth, money and the economy have to serve what is necessary for the population. Yeah. Family welfare.
Amaka, did you want to come in on these points?
No, I will take the next question.
Okay, so the next question actually was asked during your presentation, and then I think we'll have to go to final points. I've heard someone say there is not technical capacity to produce high quality vaccine in existing African facilities. Is there any truth to this claim?
That's not true. So currently, the continent has 4 vaccine manufacturers. The Pasteur Institute in Dakar, Senegal, in Tunisia, in Algeria, and then you have the BioVac in Cape Town. They have the capacity to manufacture the substance that the vaccine is made of. South Africa and Egypt also have pharmaceutical manufacturers. In fact, the 2 South African companies that have been chosen as the initial partners for the first mRNA tech hub, AfriGen Biologics and Vaccines in South Africa, and BioVac, they have the capacity. But what I want to point out is that this is a rhetoric usually peddled by pharmaceutical companies, and it's outright wrong. So if you take Moderna, for example, right? By this time last year, Moderna did not have the capacity to manufacture the millions of doses for its vaccines. What Moderna did instead was it enlisted a Swiss company, Lonza Group. Lonza Group did not have any experience in mRNA vaccine manufacturing to begin making the vaccine drug substance on Moderna's behalf. So what Lonza Group did was it rapidly retrofitted its existing plants in Switzerland and in New Hampshire in the US. And this happened because Moderna was able to share the know-how with Lonza Group. And so between May 2020 and when Lonza Group had no mRNA production capacity, and then December 2020 when it produced 20 million doses of Moderna vaccine, what happened was it rapidly retrofitted its facility thanks to the knowledge and tech transfer that Moderna did with the company. So these companies in Africa, especially BioVac and AfriGen Biologics, right? They have the plants. These plants can be quickly and rapidly retrofitted to start making mRNA vaccine. The only thing hindering them is they don't have the recipe or the technology know-how. So if Moderna and Pfizer and BioVac share their technology, share the recipe, these companies, not even only within Africa, but also in places like in South Korea, in Mexico, in SEPTA, in Bangladesh, have also requested for tech transfer, and they've been rebuffed. Companies in South Korea, they've also requested for tech transfer to make mRNA vaccines. They've been rebuffed. And so the problem is that these countries in the global south, especially in Africa, don't have the capacity. They do. They can quickly retrofit their plants to start making these vaccines. The problem is the pharmaceutical companies have refused to share this technology with these companies?
If I can just quickly add something there, by the way, I was going to share my screen to show this paper. I had my first vaccine in March of 2020, and it was given to me by a researcher that I know in vaccine technology. And we have not just mRNA vaccines now, but DNA vaccines. And this is a paper that I was involved in writing. I was very much the minor party in writing this paper, but saying it is possible now to produce vaccines in a matter of weeks, even shorter than that, after you have the actual DNA of the virus you wish to produce the vaccine for. It literally can be done that quickly, which is not like the old days when we had years and years of testing and all sorts of potential dangers in vaccines produced by infecting eggs with the virus and letting them grow the antibodies and so on. Technology's improved dramatically, and we should be using this as a prevention mechanism around out of pandemics. We have to be ready for it next time round. So I'd recommend this paper. As I said, I'm very much the minor author in this paper, but there's a possibility of building the capacity to rapidly develop vaccines, to get those to people on the front lines and stop a pandemic spreading as fast as this one spread before we finally manage to fight it back.
Amazing. Thank you both for those contributions. Laszlo?
I'd like to add, Amaka, this problem of property rights, IP, and so forth, I mean, this is prehistorical. I mean, 20-year patents nowadays, what does it mean? I mean, this is a monopoly. This is rentierism, how they call it, rent extraction. I mean, you hold this. I mean, all this health system has to serve the population, the necessity. People are dying. These guys are sitting on their patents. I mean, this is completely absurd. We have to go over this thing. Let me tell you, Amaka, this might interest you. This book is in great part about this. I mean, this is knowledge society. I'm not just pushing the book. This is. Let me tell you, all my books are free of charge online. You just write Dowbor.org or put Dowbor on the internet. You are there. We're a network of professors trying to put these ideas together, and I would welcome you to this network. Lawrence, this is a big problem because we have a big discussion and we all agree on the same things.
Yes, you're right. Next time we'll definitely bring some more polarizing views. Right, so I think we're out of time, and I don't know if we really have time for final thoughts because there's going to be a session in here immediately. But it would be amazing if in the chat, Ladislou, Steve, and Amaka, if you could post in there how people can get in contact with you after the event, how they can follow your work. As some of that has already been done, I can see, and that would be most helpful. For everyone else, you'll be able to find a lot of the details of the speakers on our website, rethinkeconomics.org/festival. And additionally, if you want to follow the COVID-19 theme, you can stay in this building, so you do not need to move. There'll be a 15-minute intermission between this session and the next one, which will be with Dr. Serbi Kassar. So I'm going to give it a minute or so for the information to be put in the chat. If you want to tweet or post about this festival, please do. It's #rethink21. Please do invite everyone who you think might be interested to come along to our next sessions. Great. I think we'll leave it there.